Hi everyone. I'll ask you to settle down. Thank you for coming down today to the writers' session of the AACTA Meet the Nominees panels being put together by AFTRS, AACTA and the Australian Writers Guild. We're lucky to be in this beautiful space, and to that I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, and in these parts it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders both past and present. I'm Becca Johnstone, and before I introduce these very talented people up here and we jump into our discussion today, I need to talk to you about something rather important, which is the Make It Australian campaign. In summary, the campaign is seeking a strong government commitment to a sustainable Australian film and television industry that supplies both a diversity and quality of Australian content for Australian and international audiences. Diversity and quality. The campaign is specifically asking for three things. Local content obligations to be evolved to include new market entrants, so your Netflix, your Amazon, telcos and SIPs. We are also asking for competitive tax offsets and also well-funded public broadcasters and screen agencies. I know I don't need to tell anyone in this room how important those three things are. To date, the Make It Australia campaign has involved a national day of action with events being held in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Hobart, Perth and Brisbane and attended by over 1,000 people. A selfie campaign where people photograph themselves with a Make It Australian postcard, and there's also even a social media frame you can use to add to your profile pictures and all that. You post these to your socials with the hashtag Make It Australian. And these selfies were then compiled to create a visual petition, which was presented to politicians in Canberra at a lobbying event held in association with the Parliamentary Friends of the Screen Industry Group. Now, there's an ongoing letter writing campaign. I can be pretty loud. If you visit the Make It Australian website, makeitaustralian.com, you can use that to send a letter on behalf to your representatives. And it's a very, very important issue. You know, we're facing as more and more outlets eschew Australian stories for the international content. It feels like the easy thing to do nowadays. So if you haven't already, please sign up to the AWG newsletter on their website to receive regular updates on the campaign via their e-bulletin. And also check out makeitaustralian.com for other ways you can help and ensure our industry continues to thrive well into the future. Finally, as you leave today, have a look for the wonderful gals. We've got Emma and Susie from the AWG handing out pins. Pins, 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 pins. Everyone's got a pin. Wear the pin, wear it proud. Photograph it, hit your socials, gram it, hashtag Make It Australian. Okay? Good, I know you will. And now, it's a privilege, truly, as an up-and-coming writer to introduce these incredible people sitting next to me. Disquietingly talented is what I like to call them. All of whom nominated in the feature screenplay categories of this year's AACTA Awards. So we have writer and director of The Butterfly Tree, Priscilla Cameron, on the end. Yeah, give her a round of applause. We have the writers of Don't Tell, Ursula Cleary and James Greville sitting next to me. Writer of Two, Berlin Syndrome and Jasper Jones, Shaun Grant. Wowzers. And writer and director of Hounds of Love, Ben Young. So I thought we'd kick it off today and talk about this whole thing of why writing. You know, a lot of writers I know talk about it coming as naturally as breathing, or you know, the thought of being anything other than a writer is just an impossibility. But for some, it takes a while to get there, to get to that point. Let's start with Ursula. When did you know that writing was for you, and why was it for you?
I guess I came to writing quite late. I started my career in advertising, then I went and worked for MTV Europe and was very much in television production, and then produced a kids television program where I did work with the writers, came back to Australia, actually worked for the AFTRS for a little while, and then worked for a funding organisation in Queensland, the Pacific Film and Television Commission, which is now called Screen Queensland. And got to a certain point in my life where I thought, well, if I'm ever going to write, I better actually do some writing. And so took what was a big financial risk and actually left. And luckily, John Edwards at the time was making a television series, well, a telemovie called Beaconsfield, and I thought I wanted to be a script editor at that stage, and so John asked me to script edit Beaconsfield. And then through that process, someone just said to me, maybe if you want to be a really good script editor, maybe why don't you write a screenplay, because then you will understand more about what writers go through. So I wrote a feature film, and it was, I learnt an enormous amount, including what I thought I actually knew and realised I didn't know. And so the process of actually writing did teach me an awful lot about, obviously, the craft, but also about myself. And I'd worked teaching on courses, teaching people to write, but it was only really through writing that I then developed a real understanding, I think, of what writers go through. And then on the back of that, Amanda Higgs and Judy McCrossan hired me to write television. So I wrote for the 2 series of The Time of Our Lives, and John Edwards, I was sort of in a lot of writers' rooms and doing different things. And then I met Tori and James, Tori Garrett, who's the director of Don't Tell. And Tori took a leap of faith when she was offered to do the film Don't Tell, and asked me if I would write a script we adapted, obviously, a book that already existed, and so then spent the next almost a year actually developing that project and writing Don't Tell. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. Ben, how about you? Was writing in your blood, or is it something you came to a bit later?
No, I studied screenwriting. I did a BA at film school. I didn't make any films when I was at film school. I just wrote a little short. But I kind of always felt that with technology going the way that it was, and making films was so much easier because the technology was so much more available, I kind of just thought, and this is why I studied writing and not directing, I kind of thought, well, the one thing which is never going to get easier is writing, is the screenplay itself. And I think inherently that's the problem with most films, is the screenplay. So I just decided to focus on that through necessity more than anything else. I wanted to be a filmmaker, and no one was writing me anything, so I had to go and write myself some stuff. Yeah.
And perhaps, James, you want to tell us, you came to writing at what time, and what was, at that time, what was influencing you, perhaps? How did it come to be?
Well, I mean, weirdly, I have a very similar career path to Ursula, in that I started in advertising and then went, weirdly, to MTV, and I used to run Cartoon Network in Europe. I had a lot of jobs where I would do a little bit of writing, and I just wanted to do more, and that's still the case. I mean, I'm not a full-time writer. I run a production company in Queensland, and we're trying to transition away from advertising, which has been very good and paid the bills and helped me raise 3 children. But my partner in the company is Tori, and she's now full-time in drama and has done, is going great guns with lots of TV, and her first feature was Don't Tell. But I got the opportunity, or I was asked to kind of help out with the last few drafts of Don't Tell, and it was fantastic. But at the same time, we've got a whole lot of stuff on our slate that we're struggling to get through and get into production. So I'm one of the questions you probably ask later is emerging. I'm an emerging screenwriter. I don't feel like woohoo, I've done it, tick that box. It's fantastic, but it's always a struggle, and any writer anywhere is probably telling you. I mean, apart from this one, who's probably got bookings going up the wazoo, but we're not sure what happens. Yeah, we're not sure where the next few gigs sort of coming from, and that's the exciting thing about it as well. But and you have to be working on your own stuff, as well as waiting to see what other things you get the opportunity to write on. So.
Pinch that back, guys. If we could use the Interesting. I'm going to turn to Priscilla on the end here, who wrote a beautiful film called The Butterfly Tree, and your directorial debut as well, I understand. It deals, I find, in some pretty complex emotions, but lots of beautiful layering of both joy and sort of pain and sadness as well in amongst it. I'd really like to know about your process for this original concept film, how it came to be, and how it came to be this just lovely thing we've all seen.
Oh, yes. Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I guess what I'd like to start with is I think as a writer, I write because if I don't write, I don't feel like I'm of value.
Okay.
I don't feel that I'm valued to me. Like, I write and I feel like I've achieved something that makes me feel good today.
So is the writing your sort of genesis of creation in this process?
Yes.
And your value
Yes.
is from that?
And then from there, I think Dara Marx says, writers don't write what they know, they write what they seek to understand. And so it's been, generally I feel like I'm driven to write something and I don't know why I'm driven to write it until it's in like draft 8, and then suddenly it hits me that what it is that I'm trying to grapple with within this story and also within my life, but it's completely unrelated to the story that I'm writing. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you guys? Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. So how The Butterfly Tree came about was I was living in Sydney and I was engaged, and I was, extremely in love in the time, but we're also fighting a lot. And so I was very disconnected. I didn't know anyone in Sydney. And so I was in this chasm and I was very, very lonely. I went and sat in a park and I had this vision of a boy sitting on a stone stairs of this very oldie-worldy building, not of this world, somewhere else. And he was waiting for a woman, and I called her the goddess, to return, and she never returned. And he waited there day and night, day and night, day and night, and she never came. And I kept thinking, well, who is this boy? Why is he waiting for this woman? And then, like, within 4 days later, I had another vision, which was of him being carried through the forest, hugging a bright green throbbing cicada. And I thought, wow, so why is this boy having these subversive insect fantasies in this forest world? And how does that come together? And then part of my life started to play in where I, someone very close to me, I'd written a draft, got breast cancer and was given a terminal amount of time to live. And I witnessed a family start to sacrifice their own wants and needs for this very vibrant, vivacious woman who was living, when you're faced with a terminal illness, it's like, a minute can become a month and a day can become 3 years. And so you're living with a very, very deep intensity, and she was. And then I witnessed this family sacrifice their wants and needs for her, and that became like the core theme of the whole film. So combination of those three things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how long was this process for you?
Yes. I feel like I always feel compelled to say this because people always say, so how long did it take? And I say, well, when I'm lying, I say 7 years, and when I'm being honest, it's 10. And then I have to say, well, I had 4 children, one of them passed away, and so I have 3 live children in that 10 years. And I think that gets negated out of conversations when you hear of a project that takes a long time to get up and people say, oh, there must be something wrong with it because it took so long. But the fact of the matter is that you have lots of other spheres in your life at play, and my sphere was family. And so I feel like I'm compelled to tell people that now because I'd hate to think that there are writers out there with bold voices who feel like it's not up in 3 years, they should give up. And you've probably got lots of other things going on, which is your life.
Really, really useful and important and pertinent, I'm sure, to many people here today. But I want to touch on the character of Finn. And hearing you speak about your children, he's so accessible, and I don't want to use the word charming, but sort of full of charm, As just personally, as someone who struggles to write children, or younger people, how did you build him, and how did your own children inform that?
Actually, Finn was based on my husband at the time, which was, there's always a child within the man. And so Finn was that child. And my then husband had a very fine appreciation of beauty, very sensitive, and a very fine appreciation of nature. And so those elements of Finn came in, and there's a sort of a purity with that. And boys of that age and younger, when I have two, do have this kind of purity that exists. And so I think it was about balancing this appreciation for beauty on a transcendental level and desire, which also kicks in around that age. And just that boy innocence that I don't think girls have in the same way that young boys have.
Really interesting. We'll change gears slightly and move over to James and Ursula, who both wrote drafts on Don't Tell, which is a gripping drama based on the true story of sexual abuse under the eyes of the Anglican Church at Toowoomba Prep. It's such heavy material. I don't think anyone can deny that. I want to know what are the challenges in bringing like a true horror story, a real life horror story into life for you guys?
I mean, I think that was one of the first things that Tori and I spoke about before I even started the draft. And we also worked quite closely with Steve Roach, who was the lawyer who wrote the book that we were adapting. And obviously, the real person whose story it was is living that story still today. And it was very clear that she had post-traumatic stress disorder, and there was a lot of sensitivity needed in order to bring this story to life. And Steve Roach, the lawyer, though, he felt it was very important that this story be told not just in the book but also as a film. And so we really had to look at, well, how... I think they had... Anne's not with us today, but Anne Brooksbank had written an earlier draft before I got involved, and then obviously before Tori got involved and before James got involved. And there was a big question about, do you show any of the child abuse? Like, how do you deal with the fact that this happened? And I think they went in one direction with that draft, and then when we were working on the project, we decided that we did not want to see that. But then luckily, and because my love is also research and real stories, and there were all the court transcripts existed, and so I was able to find them all and go through and actually read Lyndall's words and how she testified and how she dealt with that particular part of the story. And so we did use a lot of that, which is simply her talking about what happened to her as a 12-year-old, and I felt that that was probably the most powerful thing that we could possibly do. But I do think, like, there were lots of times, and especially when I met Lyndall and had to speak to her, I was saying to James this morning, you know, she was carrying, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but she seemed to be a woman who was still carrying around quite a lot of shame. And for me, I just felt if we could do anything to try and assist her in this process, that for me was a really important thing that we could do as well.
That empathy must be so difficult to separate. Maybe James, you can talk about that.
Yeah, I was just, going on from what Ursula said, I think one of our big tasks on this was we wanted as many people to see this film as possible, and part of that is making a film that's not punishing you, for going to see it. So, and I know that the actors, and when they were promoting the film, did a word on this, but the film is actually a quite uplifting film to see because, there was a triumph of sorts, and the real line that the film walks, I think that we did really well, and I got to credit Tori actually with this, is that, the film is about a victorious court case. It deals with, it goes through all of the horrible details of what this girl was subjected to and the journey that when she became a woman had to go through to feel any kind of vindication, any kind of, sort of relief. But then, sort of at no point was that, and me as a writer, it was stages, various stages of drafts. We had, them all having a glass of champagne at the end because they won this big... Got rid of all that. This wasn't a triumph, but it's a triumphant film in a way because it's a triumph of this woman's spirit, and actually something that Ursula didn't know, because I didn't meet Lyndall before I got involved in writing the drafts, and I think that was enormously beneficial for me because I had a bit more freedom, I think, and Ursula, sort of had met her and was probably feeling a little bit more like she had to, follow this woman. And the change in Lyndall, since the film's come out and since going to see screenings and everything, and, also meeting a whole lot of other survivors and things is incredible. So, I think the film walks a very careful line, and it does it well in that it's still a great screen. It's a good film to watch, and you feel, just like, I don't know, Injustice for All or, other great legal things, and you want them to fucking win at the end, and they do. It's a great, it's a great thing, and I think that was important because we wanted as many people to see it and then understand this story because it's such a common story.
Absolutely, and I want to touch on the courtroom drama aspect of it, which is it's so present and it needs to be. I understand there's rules you guys had to play by in this, and I know James, you've mentioned that you had a moral imperative not to embellish, but you also had other imperatives.
Well, I mean, first of all, doing a court case in Australia and being true to it, you have none of the Hollywood benefits of, of lawyers walking around and slamming the desk and, sort of being dragged screaming out of the courtroom saying, sort of, he fucking did it, which would be nice. But so we had to follow a thing, but also, I mean, there was a great risk. There's a whole lot of the legal people involved with this still very much alive. The character that Jacqueline McKenzie played is now a judge. You don't want to piss off a judge with any kind of, putting words in their mouth. So, the transcripts had to be, we had to be true to actually what was said and not putting things in anyone's mouths. And, also beyond the court, people like Peter Hollingsworth and things who we wanted to nail with this film because he's a creep of a man. But, we had to be very careful on how we did that. But yeah, I mean, we also, again, we had to follow, and one thing that Tori did, I know that there's this great closing argument scene which had to be written by the scriptwriters because the closing arguments for the, defence took a day and a half. So, you had to go through all of that and actually write a little bit of Hollywood into that. But, and Tori, when she had Jack Thompson's character, cross-examining the headmaster, and Jack took that and was, sort of started to get very break a morant with him and thing, and she said, no, you're not allowed to do that, keep it back and keep the whole thing. And it actually became a little bit more powerful, I think, in that restraint. And it was very true to the legal system, very true to what happened. And also, we wanted it, we didn't want any holes in this so people could say, oh, that's not how it was at all. Because we wanted the people responsible to feel all of the shame that they should have felt on why, this terrible situation happened. So, and, it's very satisfying to do that, as a writer in a true story, if you feel like that you've actually delivered some truth onto the screen. And, I've been at screenings where, and not screenings with Lyndall, but where survivors have come up because, quite often in a room of, 150 people, you'll say, statistically, there's 15 people in the room who've been, abused or more, and there is. So it's such a blight on our society, and it's, that's why it's a project that we're very passionate about, and that makes it easier to write it and easier, all of the difficulty you talk about is outweighed by you feel like you're on a mission to get the story across.
I'm going to move over to Mr. Overachiever, Shaun Grant, who, having picked up an actor for Snowtown a few years ago, you managed 2 nominations in one category this year. Best Adapted Screenplay. Berlin Syndrome, a taut, absolutely chilling modern thriller, and Jasper Jones, at its core a mystery, but it feels to me like a social sort of racial commentary of 1960s rural Australia. Brilliant films. Shaun, let's go back a step and just I'd like to ask you, why writing? Was it in your bones, or how did you come to it?
Yeah, a roundabout way. Kind of what Ben was saying when it was like I knew from the age of, I don't know, 12 or something I wanted to be a filmmaker. But I kind of went into writing not because of, his was probably more eloquent than me. The core is in writing. I came from a small country town, single mum, and I originally, I remember, trying to decide your university courses, and I said to my mum, I want to be a filmmaker, and she said, there's no money in that, don't be stupid. So I said, all right. So I didn't, and I became a school teacher, and I taught, 8-year-olds to 18-year-olds over a few years. Because, not much, but, I guess it's more regular payment. Yeah, I know. The limousine I had in my teaching days was amazing. But anyway, it was an itch that wouldn't go away. So I scratched it, and I went back. I threw in that career and went back to film school, and chose writing because I thought, well, if I do the directing, they seem really expensive, those short films that you have to make and stuff. That seems more like I can afford, $600 a final draft. I can cover that. Yeah. So I went. That was pretty much the reason, and so I went into writing. And while I was writing, I was teaching 9 to 5, and I was going to film school 5 to 9 at night, and then and this was not that long ago. And then I was writing Snowtown on the weekend because I discovered this book, and it was for literally an adaptation class in my course, and I stumbled across it one night when I was babysitting my niece. And crazy. And that was the strangest. Like literally, I'd put her to bed on a Friday night, and the power went out. Normally, I'd watch a movie or the football or something, and I couldn't. So I scoured my brother's bookshelf, and my brother's, 6'6", head to toe, tattoos, prison officer, only reads true crime. And I've written, like, everyone threw me true crime stuff over this. I never read true crime. Mm-hmm. So I was like Charles Manson, it was every, as I say to me when I'm in LA, I'm like, yeah, you guys win. It was mostly American, but there was this one Australian serial killer, and I picked it up and I read it by candlelight in one sitting from start to finish, and got to the end and said, I have to make this film. So I took it to my lecturer, and he said, I knew no one in the film industry. Like, my dad was a publican, my mum was a housewife. I didn't know anyone. And I was like, I don't know how any of this works. I had no agent. And my lecturer, Ian Pringle, who'd done some work on some films and things, said, I'll write the first 10 pages and we'll see what you got. So I did that over a weekend, brought it back in, sat at his desk as he read them, and he looked up and he said, you've got something here, get on the phone. So I cold called the author, said, I'm a student, I want to adapt your book. I figured, the book wasn't perfect, but it gave me a background, and this was a journalist that was on the case for 3 years. Sure. And as I said, I was teaching full time, so I had slightly more money than I did time for the research purposes. So I just thought, well, I'll just give him some money, and I went away over 18 months and wrote this thing, and then fast forward 3 years later and we were at Cannes, and I was happy days.
Just killing it. Just absolutely killing it. It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story, and especially when you think you were writing it as an adaptation project. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, essentially you had to find a book and do a little thing on it, and I just took it to extremes.
Yeah, of course. But to that, your films this year that have been nominated, very different films, both adaptations. You seem to be just a god at it. Is your process in adaptation, was it the same for Berlin Syndrome, Jasper Jones? Did you approach things differently?
Yeah, they came about literally at the same. I remember I was doing a Q&A at New Zealand Film Festival, and I was at Melbourne Airport flying out, and I saw the cover of Jasper Jones. It was a great cover. Still a great cover. And then I read the back, and I went, oh God, there's a film in that. Like, it reminded me of a film I grew up loving, Stand By Me kind of thing. And
Absolutely.
I was like, if I could do half a good job. And I thought, but it had won all these awards, Craig's book. And I thought, oh, someone's got that. Like, you've got to be pretty quick nowadays. The manuscripts are bought before they're even, released. So I just didn't think much of it, got on the plane, did the film festival, and then when I arrived back the next day, Vincent Sheehan, the producer, rang me and said, I've got this book, would you consider adapting it? And then I said, let me read it. I did, and I really responded to the material. And by the time I'd finished that, Polly Staniford had called me, said, I've got this book, Berlin Syndrome,
Wow.
would you have a look? Read them both and responded to them for different reasons. You know, I call myself creatively bipolar. So I wake up, I've got a bit of, my brother is actually bipolar, so it's in the genes, but I'll wake up and think the world's a terrible place sometimes. So I lock a girl in an apartment, and on other days I think it's nice. So I play cricket with 13-year-olds, and if I've always got normally at least two things on the go, so that if I'm struggling with one, a day's not wasted, and I can flip the switch and go on to the other. So I had to make a decision, and I couldn't make a decision because I responded to both. So my decision was not to have a social life for a while.
Absolutely.
And yeah, both things, they went through every funding round together. They shot at the exact same time. They were greenlit pretty much the same time. They came out not far apart. So
I'm going to come back to your adaptation, but this idea of having two projects on the go at once, how do the rest of you feel about that? Is that something you guys can do, to be so committed to two at a time? Or I know writers who, one project, that's the life, that's it until it's done.
None normally. I've always got a lot on the go, but I exclusively work on one. So, when I wrote Hounds of Love, because I'd written another film which I'd given to the producer, and she was taking so long to read it and give me notes that
That's
I was
always
just
useful.
bored. And that the character in that was a 15-year-old girl. So I was in the head of a 15-year-old girl, and I thought, well, I got to be doing something. I can't just wait for these notes forever. I'll just write another movie. About a 15-year-old girl. So
What a movie.
Yeah, so I wrote Hounds of Love because I was bored and sick of waiting for feedback on this other project. And so yeah, and that's normally what I do. Like I'll write one and it's never finished. So I'll do a draft of one and then send that off to whoever's got to read it, and then I'll do something else, and then by the time I'm done with that, the other one's come back, so then I'll do that. So I won't write one in the morning and one in the afternoon. I'll just I'll start a task, I'm going to finish this outline before I go on to that draft or whatever. So
Sure.
I set myself little tasks that I make sure I complete before moving on to the other one.
And Priscilla, are you a juggler or?
Yes, so I think it was David Lynch who said you need 4 hours to fully immerse yourself in something and don't bother doing it unless you don't have 4 hours. I go, well, David Lynch, you don't have 3 kids. That is not a luxury I have, full stop. So I have to learn to operate differently, which is I will go with whatever my gut is driving me to do. So if I go today, I start on this and I'm going to do, I usually use cards to start. So if I'm doing cards, I'll take a bunch of cards to the pool and I'm going to say I'm going to 2 hours. I'm going to come up with as many ideas for scenes as I can. And then I'll swim for an hour. And then I'll come back and I'll go, and have I got any more ideas? 5 more. If I can't get to 5, I go scrap it and move on to another project or whatever I'm working on, whether that's giving notes for another script that belongs to someone else or, or trying to sort out other shit in my life.
Yeah, sure.
So it's kind of like whatever has the urge, I try and honour that until... Or if I'm feeling really lazy, I just go, all you have to do is 5 cards, or all you have to write is 5 pages. That's it.
Good. Shaun, we'll go back to you. I want to touch back on adaptation as process, and I'm sort of a writer who's of the belief that the best adaptation process is a liberation from a text and giving it new life, and the worst are probably tellingly life in prison without parole. How do you, what are some pitfalls in adaptation, and how do you know how close to stay and when to let go?
Look, I don't know how you know. I write, essentially I think everyone does. You write for yourself because it's impossible to know what's the zeitgeist or what's going to be popular and things. So I guess I'm my own judge as to how close or far removed from the text I go. I know I'm not. If someone wants it to be exactly the text, I'm probably not the guy they're going to go to, because they're just different mediums. I just think the better adaptations do step away. Be it, I've just adapted Peter Carey, and I couldn't be more reverential to the man when I meet him, and he's amazing. But at the same time, I said to him, it has to be different. So I just want the core feeling to come across, that you've read it, because inevitably you're going to get it's not as good as the book. I mean, that's just is, and I think a lot of that comes down to, and I say that a lot of the times too, is that you're so invested in the source material because you're creating it in your head that it's kind of like a slight on you if you were to think that the film's better than your version of it. But no, I mean, my process tends to be that I'll read the book from start to finish without writing a note, and then I just sort of let it wash over me. After that, I'll read it again, sort of highlighting and jotting down particular scenes or moments that are kind of really important, and then I kind of call them the ones that you sort of can't lose. Yeah. So that's what'll last, and then everything else is up for grabs. I think it's the ones that sort of stick with me in the early reads that are the ones that have to be in it. Like I'm thinking of both. Berlin Syndrome is a short sort of novel, so I had to add a lot of story outside the walls of that apartment, and then Jasper's quite thick, so I had to choose which subplots of Craig's to lose and which to keep.
Of course, well, it's serving you well. Congratulations. Ben, I want to talk Hounds of Love. So it's your feature debut as well as director.
Yes.
Too. Wowzers. It's intense and
really?
No, walk in the park. Watched it with a 2-year-old. It's great. A harrowing film about a couple in 1980s suburban Perth who abduct and terrorise young women, ostensibly.
That's the one.
Yeah, that one. So another original concept film. You've hinted on how it came to be now, but talk us through it a bit more, and the process of writing Hounds of Love and then directing it.
Well, I kind of got... Is this working? Yeah, okay. I kind of got really jaded. When I was 25, I wrote a film which got up. It was called Die Back, and then it got down.
They do that, don't they? They get down pretty quick.
As they kind of tend to do. And that was really kind of depressing because by the time all of that happened, I was 30, and this was a film that I'd started writing when I was 21. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I had this other movie with a producer, and she just wasn't reading it. And so I just kind of thought, I don't know what I'm going to do here. And then I just had the idea for Hounds of Love. And I wrote it in 2 weeks. And it was financed 4 months from when I had the idea. So it was like record time. But it was kind of like, it was my last hurrah. It was just, I kind of knew when I had the idea. Because I think I've written 9 films and only 1 has been made. And that was Hounds of Love. But I just kind of knew when I had the idea, this is the one. And it just came to me really easily. We got financed on a first draft. And I was going somewhere with that and I've forgotten.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm just still reeling at financed on a first draft.
Yeah,
That's
it was
amazing.
it was financed through a program in Western Australia called West Coast Visions, which every year gives $750,000 to a new filmmaker. And I was lucky enough to get that. But yeah, as I was writing it was kind of my last hurrah. And because my other film had got up and then fallen over, and that was a 10-year process, Hounds was so quick, I kind of thought, well, if this doesn't happen, what am I going to do? I'm sick of being poor. And I'm so sick of working in advertising that maybe I'm just not supposed to be a filmmaker. So literally when we went to, we got the money from Screen West and then we needed more from Screen Australia. And they didn't even give us a letter of interest because and I was like, oh man, we're not going to get the money. In which case, what am I going to do? I'm not going back to advertising, so I'm going to have to be a teacher. So literally the day we sent off our application to Screen Australia, I sent my CV to every university in Western Australia because I thought if this movie doesn't get up, I need a reason to live. Yeah. So
you went all in.
That?
You went all in.
And I got offered a job at every university in Western Australia.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
That was pretty cool. But yeah, so it was a really quick process.
There you go. You want to get your film up, apply everywhere else and just give up. Just do it.
But it was really fast. It was like
Yeah.
less than 2. It was a year and a half from when I had the idea for Hounds to when it premiered at Venice. So it was whirlwind. It was crazy.
Awesome. And so this film you spent the 10 years on had the 15-year-old girl as well, yes?
Oh no, that's another one that I wrote. Yeah,
Okay, that's
no,
all right.
that had a 15-year-old girl. That one, I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Wow. They're never dead. They're never dead, as I keep getting beaten into my head every goddamn day. There are 15-year-old girls, a couple of films with them, but I want to talk about the women in this film. There are 3 women who do a great job of, I feel, carrying like all the emotional side of this story, you know.
Yeah, the movie's supposed to be about fires that men start that women put out.
Yeah. In particular, Evelyn, who I find really incredibly drawn, and I think it shows a really deft touch to create this monster. You know, we all want to create those monsters you can empathise with, and she is such a monster, but your heart breaks for her. Tell me about. Can you talk me through bringing her to life on the page a bit more?
It's interesting. So I wrote the role for Emma Booth. She's been one of my best friends for nearly 20 years. We met when we were acting opposite each other in a TV miniseries 100 years ago when I was acting. And I wrote the role for Emma. But what's so interesting is just a little bit interesting for me as a writer. In my draft of the film, I opened the movie with the couple murdering somebody together. That was their thing. And Screen Australia said, you cannot open a movie like that. Take that out now. We cannot have this. So I was like, oh, okay. So I took it out, and then I just wrote the movie about Vicky. And then when I watched the cut, I was like, it's like 14 minutes of this kind of semi-spoiled rich girl who's a bit sad because her parents are getting divorced. It was so kitchen sink, and it was awful. And so I was sitting there and I was thinking, you know what would make this movie really good? If it opened with a fucking murder. Yeah. And so anyone who's seen the film would know that it does now. And that's all constructed from offcuts and deleted scenes. The whole opening of Hounds of Love outside of the netball.
And how much of a battle was that?
After the
fact.
Well, no, I mean, it was kind of fine because what happens is once you get the money, they can't really stop you from doing anything. Sure. So the amount of times they told me to take Stephen Curry's dick out of the film was it was incredible, but I just said no. And it's not like it's not the studio system. They have no control over what you end up doing with it. And thankfully, I had a really supportive producer, and she knew that the movie sucked with the opening the way that we were told to make it. Yeah. And so I just asked for 2. I said, look, I don't know what the solution to fixing this film is, but just give me 2 weeks. And then me and Merlin, the editor, were just like, well, I think that we can make a murder, like with just like deleted. So all the first woman you see when you see her wrists and all that when she's chained up, well, they're Ashley Cummings' wrists, and you know, so yeah, and I think so all of the stuff was deleted scenes, or the body parts we saw, they were all Ashley's as well. So yeah,
amazing. All right. In the film industry, I know we get criticised a lot for being either just far too Sydney or Melbourne centric, really, you know. But I look at this panel, we've got 3 writers from Queensland. Yep. 1 from WA and a transplant in LA, but Melbourne, but grew up in rural Victoria, a small town, yeah. And all writing films set outside of the 2 major cities, you know. And each of these films feels quite tied to their locations, if I can say so. You know, do you feel as writers there's a connection between this about where you're from and who you are in the films and the stories you're telling, as to location and story?
I mean, I feel that I'm drawn to stories and telling stories about places that I guess I know either through first-hand experience or through research. So when I think about stories and when I'm thinking about settings and locations, usually it's places I've lived in my life. I'm doing a big World War I project at the moment that's actually set in London, but because I lived in London for a couple of years, I'm finding I can recreate it. But with the films that I do, because I live in Brisbane and I have lived there for a long period of time, I do find that everything, like even down to the details of the houses that I've lived in, they are the houses that I'm using in my screenplays. Having to write a television series that was set out of Melbourne, it was really good that I got to spend an awful lot of time in Melbourne, because otherwise you have to do a lot of research of just things like, how do people catch trains? How do they catch buses? Where would you go? So that you're not finding that your script is just not appropriate to the location. So I guess it's write what I know, and what I know is also where I've been.
Well, we've got a couple of projects at the moment that are, and you know, some of them are set where we are, and where we're going to get the money for them is quite often a big driver in that. You know, which is, and you know, that's no lie. You're looking at where you're going to shoot it, and suddenly a funding body that will be interested enough to say, oh, you're going to bring some jobs to our state, so, you know, we'll give you some money. But you also look, you know, and sometimes you see stories that are going to be great in somewhere you're very familiar, and then sometimes you're at a dinner party with someone who tells you a great story about how he lived in the Tiwi Islands for, you know, 3 years, and this ridiculous set of stories that happened there, and so you get on a plane, you go to the Tiwi Islands, you meet a whole lot of people, and then you write that story. So I think it depends, you know, sort of sometimes you are, but I think there's a genuine, you know, interest in exploring places that haven't been explored on screen before, and sometimes you just drive through somewhere and you go, fuck, this would be amazing for a, you know, I mean, again, another couple of the projects that we're working on are tiny little town projects, and we're thinking, you know, even though these stories probably happen in WA or wherever, we're thinking we could shoot in Queensland because that's where the money's, you know, going to come from for us. So it's a, you know, I'd love to be more poetic about it, but sometimes it's a business we're in. Yeah, go on.
Doing this. What was it? Location, right? Berlin Syndrome was Melanie's book, and I thought it was the greatest. Like even though you don't leave the apartment too much, but it was the greatest link of a location to a story I've read for a while. Like, you know, the film's dealing with past sins and all of this, and the city itself is. So I thought, you know, and this is not me, this is her. It was just a great idea, and it was one of the reasons. And I have travelled and loved that city of Berlin, and so why not do a movie there? But I don't know if I think of location. I mean, I definitely agree. You have to get a sense of it. You know, of doing a film in the Midwest of America at the moment, so you travel through and you look at all of that. But it's also, you know, as you travel through, there's differences, but there's also those common similarities that, you know, you go to farm, and having been around farms my whole life, you kind of get this sense of we're all one people, you know, kind of thing. So, I you know, if I'm in LA, you know, I'm confident I can write an American film, even though I'm not American. It just takes a little bit more time, but people are people, kind of thing.
Well, I'm from Perth, and so I just wrote the film because it's where I was from, and I knew that they had the Grant West Coast Visions, which I was specifically writing it for. But I guess, I mean, it's obviously Perth. I think there's a card at the beginning of the film saying Perth 1987. And for me, it was kind of important because, you know, I'm West Australian. I grew up there. I've spent my whole life there. And there's something to me which is kind of weird about it. I think it's the most isolated capital city in the world. And there's something about that I think kind of made it all scarier, you know? Like, we're just this little dot in the middle of nowhere, and this kind of shit goes down. So, yeah.
Interesting. Anything?
I'm not sure what I can add
Yeah.
in terms of what everyone else has said. I guess, you know, you choose locations for a project because A, you know, the project requires it. B, where does the money come from? Can you shift it? C, you know, for me, a big one is, depending on the budget of the project, how am I going to visually wring the most juice out of this?
Sure.
Can I change the location to actually give me a different visual landscape, which will either A, make it harder for the characters in this journey just by changing that environment, or B, make the visuals of it much more exciting for us to see with regards to the butterfly tree, because he has this insect fantasy world. I really wanted the world to be dominated by a forest landscape that would serve that magical realism aesthetic without having to spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
And B, it's like the world of insects. So, even the soundscape was going to be driven by a whole orchestra of insects. That was the whole idea behind it. And the other reaction was I just got tired of seeing one note Australia. So we're either seeing all kind of urban Australia, or we're seeing dusty, dry Australia. And I thought there's so many other different facets that we have to offer an audience visually. And so I was looking for something that sat outside those boxes.
And it does. It really does. It's great. Okay. I'm going to hit you with some Franz Kafka because I can. A non-writing writer is a monster courting insanity. Now, we're a room full of writers at varying stages in our careers, but we all know what it's like to become stuck, and whether that's not necessarily writer's block, whether you believe in it or not, or maybe we don't get a job for a few months, years, or we have so many ideas swimming and we can't latch onto one, or the opposite, maybe we're just feeling uninspired. I think we can all relate to that insanity that can ensue. How do you push through these lulls? Do you lean in, or do you separate yourself and do something else?
Go live some life in between, I'd say.
Yeah.
I think we're touching on something we talked about before. You have a number of projects, so sometimes one project isn't working, even if that's the one that's got some hairy deadline. Go and work on something else and help yourself through that moment. But for us, we have 5 or 6 projects on. They're all at different stages. Some are at treatment, some are at script. You've always got a half-written script that has fallen onto the back burner. And sometimes, even though you know that one's probably not going to go anywhere, go and spend a day writing for that and just remember, or read it and thought, shit, this isn't too bad, and re-inspire yourself. But I actually find a deadline is really good. Because when you absolutely know that you have to have something in 3 weeks or something, then, and I'm not a writer who can write all day, but I'm weirdly enough for someone to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and write for 3 hours before I get out of bed, and then have a normal life for the rest of the day, and then have to revisit, again the next morning. So it's everyone just finds their own process, and like I said, a deadline. At the end of the day, it's a job, and when you've got to have something in. The angst of not having made any progress is worse than the angst of hitting it. Even if you write some shit and have to tear it up, you feel better having done it.
Oh yeah, I'd emphasise keyword write shit. Yeah. It is. I've always said, I can't afford to have writer's block. Currently, with the deadlines are my friend. A bunch of different things that I'm doing. I just get up and do it. I do kind of sit at my desk all day. I'm with David Lynch. I don't have children. God, I'd never see them if I did. But I don't know. Someone said you have 4 hours of creativity in the day. And if I could turn it on like that, I could sit down at 8 and be done by midday. But it takes me about 3 hours, I reckon, before I'm in the groove. And then, in the last couple of hours are probably awful, but I've still got to go through that as well. And I just can't afford writer's block, so I just write bad stuff. And I know when I'm writing it, it's bad, but it's not going to get any better if I don't. So I just write, and I'm like, oh, God, this is awful. This is not going to be in it. But I'm just hoping by the time I get to the end that something good will come of it. And normally I finish my day, when I was living in Melbourne, I would finish at 5:36 or whatever and go for a jog with the dog, and I would think I'm the worst writer in the world. That was all absolute garbage. And then I go to sleep, and then I normally start my day by reading over what I wrote the day before. And there'll be a line or a character or a moment or a scene, and I go, that doesn't suck. And that to me is the writer's equivalent of a standing ovation for an actor. Because it drives me for the next 8 hours. I'm like, oh, that feeling was good. I like not sucking. So I just go for 8 and a bit hours, and then I feel awful again, and then I go to sleep, and I wake up, and I go, I'm not awful, and then I just keep going again. It's pretty much on repeat.
I kind of, I don't really have much of a process as far as sitting down and doing it for X number of hours a day. Sometimes I can sit at the desk all day, but that's very rare. I'm usually at my best in the morning, so I get up and go straight to my laptop and write for an hour and a half, maybe 2, then go to the gym and then come back and do it for another hour and a half, and then I go and watch a movie nearly every day. I just take myself by myself, and then that kind of inspires me to come back and write a little bit more in the afternoon. And I'm kind of with Shaun. I don't really believe in writer's block. You know, it's just like, it's always hard. And I think, and it gets harder as well. The more you realize, the more you do it, the more you realize that you don't know, I guess. And so if I am stuck on a moment, I mean, you outline, I don't know everyone else's process, but I outline so extensively that by the time I'm actually at the script, I know everything that's going to happen, so you don't really get...
Got the GPS and...
Yeah, so you don't really get blocked then, but if for whatever reason I'm feeling uninspired or I can't get a scene right, I just usually like grab a character from the film and I just write about them, just like prose, just like give them a backstory and just develop them more and more and more, because it's writing, and then it's amazing how that often triggers ideas that ultimately lead to the solution.
Now, look, being a full-time writer is it's not easy. We all know that. But I have this feeling the only thing more difficult thing than that is wanting to be a full-time writer. And there are a lot of emerging writers in this room, and I'd like to, if we can, just briefly talk about what the tipping point for you was and how you pushed through that emerging writer stage, what your break was, or if you're still there, how do you wander through what feels like an increasingly difficult landscape for emerging writers in this country, as much as we're doing to bring them up?
I was very fortunate that Snowtown kind of did what it did. I remember even before Snowtown, I was writing, as I was school teaching, and then Snowtown was read by Film Vic, and they chose 8 filmmakers from around the country, like Glendon Ivan and Rachel Ward, and who else was there? There was a few of us, and we went away to work on our projects, and Ian David was one. Now, Ian David wrote a thing called Blue Murder, which to me is the greatest Australian television ever made. If you haven't seen it, please do, because I hand out my copy to every person I meet. And on that trip, we were working on Snowtown, we were having a fine old time, and then on the Friday, Ian David was like, "Shaun, can I have a word?" And I was like, "Yes, sir, sure." And we hadn't spoken that much. He said, but he'd been listening because you kind of commented on everyone's script, and he said, "You remind me of me. Do you want to come and write a show for Channel 7 with me?" So I had to ring my principal and says, "I'm not coming in on Monday." And my brother, God bless him, he was driving me there, and we were like, "Oh, get Ian David's autograph, it's going to be great." And I got back and he "Did you get it?" He said, "No, but I start work Monday creating a show with him." So I kind of jumped a lot of parts. So I was very fortunate. So I've been a full-time writer ever since, and that was, however many years ago. That was Killing Time, a show we did together. So I know it's not that easy, and I know I'm only half decent at it because I do it so much. Like it's just hard to get good at anything if you're not doing it. It's the same. Actors not working all the time. How do you get good at it? You can go to school and stuff, but there's nothing like doing it. I do it so much that now I have the skills to be able to. So it's really hard. It's just about finding the time. When I was at film school, I didn't make any friends. I made no friends in film school because I had no time to make friends. And a lot of them were a little bit younger than me maybe at the time. They went straight out when they were 19, and I taught, which I think is a good thing for anyone that's maybe older and coming at it later. I do think life experience is the best thing you can have, because my early stuff, I just wrote versions of Tarantino, or something that I've watched that I kind of liked, but gave it a different title.
Is it for emerging writers? Is it finding your voice? Do you feel that's first? I mean, it should be first step for all writers. No, Priscilla.
Finding your voice. I think you're always finding your voice. I think you have many variations of your voice within you, and it's kind of like, what is this voice? I think perhaps what we're really talking about is how do you be original, and how do you be bold, and how do you give us something So we haven't quite seen like that before, that still comes from a place of authenticity. And I think that's kind of difficult because I find Australia inherently conservative. So I think trying to stand out here is perhaps more difficult than trying to stand out in Europe. Like I write with an original bold voice. I think it's actually harder here because of fear. So, no, don't know where I was going. I'm done.
There's two great challenges with being an emerging writer, and one is be good at it. You know,
Always
you can't
helps.
afford to get around that. I mean, if you're a shit writer, no one's going to hire you. So you've got to hone your script and hone your craft, and you do it as much as you possibly can. To what Shaun said, I mean, you know, it's really hard if you're not doing it every day to get better at it, but you've just got to, you know, punish yourself and keep writing stuff. And the other thing is getting stuff in front of the right people. And sometimes you are in a position to do that, and sometimes it's really hard to do that. And, you know, I mean, from Shaun's story, he took it to his lecturer, who may or may not have been connected enough to, you know, to say that, you know, to put him in touch with the right people. But, you know, it was obviously good in the first place.
Well, I can say, yeah. I mean, because I do get that thing. I remember when I was in film school, and I remember a lecturer saying, make sure you watch Neighbours, because that's what you're going to be writing. Like, it was the only thing Melbourne was kind of making at the time. And I was like, fuck, I haven't watched Neighbours since Kylie. Like, the fuck am I going to do? So I went, but anyway, I was confident or cocky or whatever. I was like, don't do that. I'll make this art house serial killer thing. And but again, I didn't know anyone. But I wrote this script and this thing of you got to know people. Now I didn't know anyone in the film industry. But I wrote it. I watched films that I admired. I went to the Encore directory. I wrote down the names of 4 producers. I cold called 4 producers. They didn't know me from Bar Soap. I said, I've written this film. Now, it did help that it was called Snowtown. And it instantly sort of went, oh, we kind of know that story. How do you make a film out of that? But they all read it because producers are desperate for stories. They just want good stories. So this idea of knowing someone's just not true. It just needs to be good. And they all...
Cold called 4 producers.
Yeah.
Which is something that a lot of people will sit there with their good thing and not make that step. And it's hard. It's really fucking hard to cold call people and say, and, you know, particularly when you're coming from, I'm absolutely no one, and I've just written this thing. And, you know, that same producer has probably read 17 absolute piles of shit in the last, you know, sort of 6 weeks. So you can understand their point of view, but you've still got to have the balls to do it.
Yeah. And you've got to have a thick skin. You've got to be prepared, because all day, every day, all I hear is problems. Like, no one stops to go, geez, that bit's good. It's all like, we've got to fix this so that we can get to production. So if you don't have that thick skin, this is not the career to be chasing.
We have only a little bit of time left, but we want to open it up for some questions from the audience. Stick your hand up high and strongly, please, and we'll get a mic to you. There we go.
Have any of you ever read a script that influenced or informed your own writing style? Like a screenplay for an actual film that exists?
Well, when I'm writing, because I write in so like that. When we're going back to the voice thing, I think I have a voice of, you can kind of see that the film's mine, but at the same time, Jasper Jones is starkly different from Berlin Syndrome, and I get bored easy. So I try to find a voice in every different thing that I do, and one thing that helps me do that is when I'm writing, you know, a Western like Kelly Gang or whatever else. There will be scripts that influence me that I'll have on the desk or on the laptop that I, you know, when I'm stuck sitting, I just read over a few scenes and it gets me into that tone or that realm. But yeah, not a particular script that, you know, it depends on the project, but there's certainly scripts or films, like Ben saying, going in and watching a movie that I'm sure even as a director will influence the film that you're making. So I always have a pile that I'm reading depending on if it's a Western or a political thriller or a coming of age, whatever the story may be.
I think it's a matter of some time. I mean, quite often I'll go back and read a script because I've just loved the movie. But and there was actually this weird thing. I was thinking this morning. There was this. Someone was doing demonstrations of motion graphics. You know what motion graphics are? Just putting things up. And they did this series, and there was dialogue out of Superbad and out of Pulp Fiction, just created into. And moments like that, you just realise how fucking amazing the dialogue was in those two movies, and then you suddenly go back and read that script just because you want to see what it was like from its inception. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm happy to watch the movie. Other times I like it so much that I just want to go back and read the script and see how it differed from the final cut, because it often does.
Ben, any influences or?
Yeah, other than my own scripts, the only script that I have in my house is Alien. I bought a copy. No, I think my mum got me that for Christmas one year. But cool. I think that's really, really well written, and it's really kind of fun to look at as well because there's so much white space. He doesn't overcomplicate anything, and it's a pet hate of mine as a director now. Who does other people's films. I hate seeing too many words on the page because it's like, yeah, I don't care. Like, what do I really need to know? Okay, that. So, yeah, Alien is really good because it's so minimal, and I think it's beautiful.
Hello, I was just wondering, what are the logistics of writing and filming in an international location? Obviously, that increases the budget quite a lot, but do you have to have a producer on the ground in that country? You have to get visas. It sounds like you made it sound so easy, or if anybody else has any experience in that. And I'm wondering, does it change everything really?
In regards to Berlin Syndrome, there was talk we were going to do a co-production, and then Polly just made the decision that no, she wanted to be the sole sort of producer on it, and the folks. I mean, she had Angie, but in the end, it wasn't. So we spent 3 weeks in Germany and 3 weeks in Melbourne, so that the apartment was just recreated on the soundstage, and we had to have we had a German crew, but other than that, I mean, it's not easy. I wouldn't recommend it, but because, like I said before, in regards to the setting was a character in that film, there was no way around shooting in Berlin at some stage. We kept it down to a minimum, so we didn't, because I think if you go to a certain level, if we shot the whole thing there, it would have to be a co-pro, but that's what we wanted to do. So it's not easy. I mean, if you can, I wouldn't recommend it, but if your story is set in a place that is not in this country and it has to be there, then you have to find a way to make that work, I think.
Hi. Apart from Ben, nobody else has really mentioned in their writing process using script editors or feedback notes, and I'm just interested to hear how often you use them and how much you rely on them, or if you don't rely on them at all, and who do you work with when you're developing your scripts?
I think having someone who can give you good notes is essential, and sometimes that's a script editor or a producer or a director. But one of the things I will say, and I'd be interested in the other panel's comments, is I find that in working in film, the notes are always heavily negative, so that rarely does anyone point out that there's anything good in the script at all. And recently I wrote a novel just because I had a script that I was having trouble. I had someone option it, and then everyone kept saying, oh, this is too ambitious, and I think ambitious means, there's no market for it. But and what I did was I thought, well, I'm going to write a novel. And so I just wrote the novel, and then when I had people read it to give me feedback, the feedback, it was so supportive. Like, it wasn't any less critical in terms of the things I needed to do. And being a first-time novelist, it was a big learning curve, and there were many things that I actually had to redo and revisit. But it was much more supportive in terms of the way they worked with me in terms of trying to get me to see what I needed to do and maybe how I could get there. than I have ever found. And also, I have to say, God, if I ever script edit someone else's script ever again, and I've script edited a lot of scripts, I will be much more supportive in looking at what they've already done that's really good and go from there, rather than just come in with, oh my God, look at all this work we've got to do to get to, a script that can be shot.
I've worked with a script editor on 3 feature projects, and I loved every single one of them. I'm trying to remember their names. There's Karen Altman, who I'm working just on a treatment with out of Melbourne, who is fantastic. There's a lady from UCLA who Screen Queensland loved, and I'm trying to remember her name, something like Whitney or someone. I think she's quite famous, but she was... she worked on Don't Tell, and by the time I came on to Don't Tell, literally we had 3 months until we were shooting, or 2 months until we were shooting, so we were really up against it. And so worked with her. Literally, I remember sitting in a car park. I was driving between one place and another, and had a conference call with her in the rain, halfway down the Gold Coast, and the 2 producers, sort of sitting on the line. She was fantastic. Again, I mean, she's hard-nosed, tells you things that really aren't working for her, but at the same time, she had a way of doing it in a nice way, so you felt like she was supportive. The ex-head of development from Screen Australia, who's a Scotsman, I'm trying to remember his name. He was lovely. I worked with him on a project that, again, it was my version of Ben's project that was up, Village Roadshow, Screen Queensland. Everyone loved it, won a Monty Miller Award, but someone at Screen Australia didn't like it and it got shot down. So,
only takes one.
But yeah, so it's a negative business, but I think there's some great script editors, and it's an absolutely worthy process when you find the right one. And a lot of the negative notes we're talking often doesn't come from script editors; they're coming from other people, producers, funding bodies.
Hello, thank you for your stories. My question's also around collaboration, but more so around the character's voice, because we're writing from, characters that may not necessarily be yourself, whether it's religious, sexually, or gender. Would you ever engage those people in the world to actually get their dialogue and the ear for it? And when do you do that?
I wouldn't. I just I cast all of the characters as my friends, and because everybody constructs sentences differently and uses different words, and so I'm like, all right, well, this Evelyn character kind of reminds me of my friend Emma Booth. So how would Emma say this? And I do that with all of them. So I just imagine people who I know and imagine how they would speak.
I think I love good dialogue and I hate bad dialogue. I just read an awful lot of scripts for something that had, and lots of them had bad dialogue in. So I tend to write dialogue, but then I have to go back and think, oh, all these characters are sounding like me. So then you do have to go, well, what is, and and I think Ben was saying sometimes he'll just go and write a page on this character and give them a little bit more definition, and then you work out, well, would they have said it that way and things. So you just got to work out whatever your process is to separate your characters out and give them voice. But you've also got to listen to people, and it's you got to in a different way. You listen to a conversation between people, or on the bus, or in wherever you're doing it. I wrote this. The film that didn't get up was about a whole lot of kind of street kids, and I found sitting outside Hungry Jack's in the Queen Street Mall in Brisbane was really useful because, Australian street kids suddenly all sound like they're American street kids because that's, it's all bro and hey, yeah, man, and things, and I feel uncomfortable writing it that way. Another project I'm working on is an Indigenous project, and so I went up to the Tiwis and listened to people, but I realised at that point with the number of Indigenous characters that I can't write that, so I've actually got an Indigenous writer to write that because it just wouldn't, I can't in good conscience feel like I could write these characters, so that's got to come from somewhere else.
Sorry, guys, that pretty much has us out of time, unfortunately, and we got to get out of here. Gang, congratulations, not only on your AACTA noms, but in telling really important stories, each and every one of you, I feel. It's very good stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Priscilla Cameron, Ben King, Shaun Grant, James Greville and Ursula Cleary. And just as you leave, a reminder here today from the AWG, we have General Manager Emma Rafferty and Pathways Manager Susie Hamilton. They and the wonderful Olga and some other helpers will be handing out your hashtag Make It Australian pins. Grab one, Instagram it,
Can I
do
put
it.
in a plug for the
Absolutely.
Writers Guild?
Yeah.
I joined the Writers Guild when I was studying. And when Snowtown was getting made, as I said, I didn't know anyone. And I was trying to option a book. I didn't have a lawyer, of course. I didn't know anyone. And the Guild did my contracts for me. They did everything for nothing. And to this day, I still, they are. And to this day, they have sorted out arbitration area, all sorts of things. They're amazing and don't have nearly enough money. So if you're not like, I think the students' ones are pretty cheap when I got it. It will assist.
As an emerging writer, they are your best friend. And I say that with emerging writer status. Okay. Thank you.